There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. Today's video is all about the 5 main aluminium products: Alumina Solution, Aluminium Scrap, Aluminium Ingot, Alclad aluminium sheet, and Aluminium Casing. Also, yes, I pronounce it aluminium, not aluminum, I'm sorry. Aluminium is vital in Satisfactory. It creates items such as radio control units, it even creates heat sinks, and even batteries, which are also extremely important and I'll be making a dedicated video on in the future. However, some of these recipes are rather complex. So I've done the calculations for all the recipes, and then we're going to go over every single one. Done a very similar thing with heavy modular frames, supercomputers, regular computers, motors, radio control units, and so many more items. So without further ado, let's just get straight into it. Starting off with Alumina Solution, where we've got 2 different recipes here. First thing to note is that one recipe produces silica as a byproduct, whereas the second recipe does not. And the reason as to why this is so important is because a future recipe actually requires silica. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Now though, let's just talk about the basic Alumina Solution recipe, and for these 2 examples we'll be creating 100 Alumina Solution per minute. So in order to create this, you are going to need 100 bauxite and 150 water per minute, and as a byproduct again you get that 41.667 silica per minute, which is not a fantastic amount because of that number being a bit weird, but it's still a decent amount of silica itself. For a comparison, this would normally require roughly 25 raw quartz and 1.12, roughly, constructors per minute in order to create your 41.667 silica. So you're getting this essentially for free. Power consumption wise, this is not too bad. Consuming 25 megawatts from your refinery and roughly 26 megawatts from your 2 water extractors, you'll be looking at about 51 megawatts of consumption throughout this project. This is okay, but let's move over to our second recipe, where, as you can see, we are not creating silica as a byproduct. Instead, we are only consuming 83.3 water and 83.3 bauxite, which is significantly less than before. And as we can notice here on the right hand side, this actually has got a pretty big effect on our total power being consumed, with only 13 megawatts being consumed from the refinery and 14 being consumed from the 1 water extractor. So if we were to compare both of these recipes here, we can see this recipe consumes the least amount of bauxite and the least amount of water, and it consumes the least amount of power and requires the least amount of machines. So in total, I would actually recommend going with this recipe because you get more solution for your bauxite. So this is really good, unless you really are desperate for some extra silica and you haven't got any raw quartz to spare, then you could go for this. But if you don't really want to worry about silica, as again I'll show you in just a minute, you might not even need to worry about this, then I do recommend going with this recipe. And this will be the recipe I'll be using for the next few examples. Just very quickly, if you enjoy videos like this and you want more guides, tips and tricks, then feel free to subscribe if you wish. You don't have to, but it's a good way to support the channel. You'll also get notified whenever I drop one of these videos. Thank you for all the continued support on the channel, but without further ado, let's get straight back into the video. So that's our solution done. Now let's move on to our aluminium scrap. The first 2 recipes aren't bad at all. However, the final recipe I would not recommend, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But starting with the basic aluminium or aluminum scrap recipe, where we are making 200 scrap for all 3 examples. To make our scrap, again, we are using the exact same Alumina Solution. However, this time we have to consume 133.4 per minute, which requires 112 per minute of bauxite and a bit of water as well. It also requires coal in order to make the scrap, and this is the biggest difference between the first and second recipe, is the coal. Additionally, you actually get 66.7 water per minute as a byproduct from your aluminium scrap, which what I'd recommend doing is re-adding this water back into your circuit to create the Alumina Solution, thus meaning you only actually have to get 45.3 water per minute from your water extractor, rather than 112. This saves you on power and of course having to deal with more liquids, which is a win-win. In total, our resources consumed is 112 bauxite, 112 water, if we're not including re-adding the water back into the circuit, that is, and 66.7 coal per minute. Not too bad. And power-wise, again, not too bad either. Unfortunately, we do have to deal with an extra refinery, and that is, of course, to make our aluminium scrap. We do kind of need that. So that consumes in total 33 megawatts, if we're not fully overclocking all of them, which there's no reason to do for this example. And for our one water extractor, that consumes roughly 19 megawatts. So we're looking at 52 megawatts worth of power, which in total is not too bad, as we'll go on to see. Example number 2 now, and this is rather similar to our previous example. Again, we are making 200 aluminium scrap, we've got a bunch of water being produced as a byproduct that's being re-added back into here. However, the plus side is that we're actually getting more water as a byproduct from this recipe, which means you have to end up consuming less water from a water extractor, which saves you on power, and overall it's a really good thing. Additionally, we are using petroleum coke here, rather than coal, and I know that a lot of people will instantly be turned off by this because petroleum coke is created from heavy oil residue, which in itself is then created from crude oil. But we're only using 10 crude oil per minute, which to make 200 aluminium scrap is really not that much at all. And bear in mind, if you don't want to deal with the hassle of transporting a liquid, which I do not blame you at all, what you could do is just turn your crude oil into heavy oil residue, then turn that into petroleum coke, and there you go. You're now exporting a solid, which makes life so much easier. And again, because it's only 40 per minute, you can probably squeeze it into a train or anything relatively easily without worrying about too many carriages or any of that nonsense, so that's fantastic. Also, I mean, you do get 6.67 polymer resin as a byproduct, but this is relatively useless. For a comparison, 6.6 polymer resin combined with 2.2 water creates just 2.2 plastic per minute, so it's not really worth it. Overall, this recipe is actually really good. You don't need to use that much Alumina Solution, you don't have to use that much water or crude oil. However, the power consumption is a little bit higher, because we are using 4 refineries for this project, which consumes 55.2 megawatts, and of course we're also using that one water extractor which consumes 16.5 megawatts. However, again, that's for the 100 water per minute, not for the 30 water per minute which you'll get if you re-add the water back into the cycle. This leaves us with a total of 81.7 megawatts worth of power, which is quite a lot higher than our basic recipe. Before I talk a bit more about those 2 recipes, let's move on to our 3rd recipe, which is the instant scrap, which is actually made in the blender. And the first thing you might notice is that it still involves coal, bauxite, and water, except we are not making Alumina Solution. We are just going straight into aluminium scrap, which is fantastic, in theory. Assuming 40 water per minute is relatively simple and not that difficult to do. 100 bauxite, again, pretty decent, and 66.7 coal per minute, not too bad either. For a comparison, this is the exact same amount of coal we are consuming in our first example, and the exact same bauxite we are consuming in our second example. So you can call this recipe Hannah Montana because it's the best of both worlds, where you're using the lowest amount of bauxite and a pretty okay amount of coal, and of course water being there as well. If it was just this, I would recommend this recipe to the moon and back. However, it's not, because we are dealing with sulfur, and this is, I suppose, where your personal play comes into this. If you don't mind consuming sulfur, you might really like this recipe, because again, we're not really using much of anything else. But if you don't really want to use sulfur or sulfuric acid, you might want to avoid this recipe. It's also important to note that we actually produce 33.4 water as a byproduct, which I just put straight back into our sulfuric acid into a 1:1 ratio, which is fantastic and super handy. So the only water we actually need from our water extractor is 40 per minute, which is like a third of the water extractor, which is, again, pretty good. Honestly, overall, this recipe is not even that bad. The one blender consumes 50 megawatts, which is a bit of a shame, and of course you have to have blenders unlocked, which you might not have by the time you start making aluminium scrap, so do bear that in mind. You also need one water extractor and just one refinery. And in total, we're looking at about 76.7 megawatts worth of consumption. And resources-wise, This again is what we're looking at. Okay, that was quite a lot of information. Let's break it down a little bit simpler. The first recipe consumes the most amount of bauxite, the most amount of water, and a pretty high amount of coal. However, it has got the best power consumption ratio. The second recipe consumes joint the lowest amount of bauxite, an okay amount of water, and a very low amount of crude oil. And the final recipe consumes again joint the lowest amount of bauxite, the lowest amount of water, quite a big chunk of coal joint with our basic recipe, and sulfur. But I think overall, this middle recipe, the electrode aluminium scrap, is my personal preference. But again, if you don't mind using sulfur, you might prefer this. But personally, I think this is really good. Water consumption wise, it's not that bad at all. Crude oil is basically nothing. And bauxite is only 100 per minute, so you do save on that bauxite, which is great. It means that you can then use more of that bauxite to create more Alumina Solution, which means you can then create more aluminium products as time goes on. Okay, fantastic. We've now talked about the Alumina Solution, the Aluminium Scrap. Now it's time to move on to the Aluminium Ingot. This is where things get a bit interesting. And I say that because this recipe consumes silica. There's also one alternate recipe which does not consume silica, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. For the first recipe, I've used my regular sloppy alumina recipe because I think it's fantastic. However, for science, I've also used the Alumina Solution for another example. This way we can actually see, is creating all this silica worth it? Is it really good? Do you get a lot of silica from it? And how much extra silica, if any, do you have to make? Because I feel like that's quite an important question. So let's see. And we are starting with our regular Alumina Solution recipe. So to create our 100 aluminium ingots per minute, which all three examples will be doing, we need to have 125 silica, which then requires 75 raw quartz. Overall, not terrible, not fantastic. We also need 150 aluminium scrap, and I am using that electrode recipe I've just showed you previously. So we are getting 52.5 water as a byproduct from this. We loop that back around, which means we only have to consume 22.5 water per minute from our water extractor. We also have to consume 75 bauxite, which honestly is not that much at all. Regarding our petroleum coke, look how fantastic this is. We only have to consume 7.5 crude oil per minute. I will very quickly mention though, I'm actually using an alternate recipe here. It looks very similar to this, where you're creating polymer resin and heavy oil residue. Except this recipe is called polymer resin, where as you can see, we get a lot more polymer resin in regards of these two. However, it consumes 30 crude oil, not 7.5. So the recipe that I'm using is the heavy oil residue, where again, as we can see, it requires a lot less crude oil, but we get a lot less polymer resin. So make sure you are using the correct recipe, because these two are extremely similar. Power consumption wise, yeah, it's not great. We are definitely starting to consume a bit more power now, but it is what it is. A lot of that is coming from the foundries and from the refineries. Less so from the water extractor and the 4 constructors. Let's have a quick gander at the resources consumed. We're looking at 75 bauxite, 75 water, not including the water that we re-add back into the cycle, 7.5 crude oil, which still makes me laugh a little bit of how little this actually is, and 75 raw quartz, which is not fantastic, but again, it's not terrible. So let's see how this recipe compares if we use our basic Alumina Solution recipe. So again, we are making our 100 aluminium ingots, 150 aluminium scraps. That's an all coming back down here again. And this is our first major change, since obviously crude oil won't be changing since we're not really touching this part. So for the 90 Alumina Solution, we need 90 bauxite per minute and 135 water per minute, which luckily is sweetened a little bit from re-adding the water back into the cycle, which means we only have to consume 82.5 water per minute. And of course, as a byproduct, we are making 37.5 additional silica. When we re-add this back over here, it then means we only have to create 87.5 silica per minute. So yes, you are making silica from this, but you're still consuming a lot of silica and a fairly decent amount of raw quartz. Let's look at both recipes side by side. The first recipe, which is using the sloppy alumina, which I definitely recommend, consumes less bauxite, it consumes less water, it consumes the same amount of crude oil, since again we're not really touching that part of the recipe, but it only really consumes like 20 something less raw quartz. So if you're desperately trying to save raw quartz and you don't care about bauxite, you might want to use this recipe. However, we are not done. We've still got one more recipe to talk about, and that is the pure aluminium ingots. Again, we're creating our 100 aluminium ingots here, except we do not need any sort of silica product being involved. And in total, we are going to consume 200 aluminium scrap, which obviously is a bit more than before. Because of this, we then need to consume 40 petroleum coke, which requires 10 crude oil. But don't fear, we get the most amount of polymer resin out of all three recipes. That is right, an astonishing 6.67, which is abysmal, but oh well. We also have to consume 120 Alumina Solution, which requires 100 bauxite and 100 water, or 30 water per minute if you again cycle back in this water. Power consumption wise, it's not fantastic. We are almost breaking that 100 megawatts mark, but what can you do? We are making a fairly complex part at this stage. Okay, now let's have a quick gander at the total recipes here. The first recipe, you consume the least amount of bauxite, and you still consume the least amount of water, and joint the least amount of crude oil. However, you consume the most amount of raw quartz. So this recipe requires the most raw quartz. The second recipe consumes 90 bauxite, which is not great, it's not terrible. It consumes the most amount of water, which, to be fair, there's almost like an infinite source of water, so that's not really too bad. It also consumes the joint least amount of crude oil, and sort of the least amount of raw quartz, because the last recipe doesn't consume any raw quartz. Speaking of the last recipe, it consumes the most amount of bauxite, the second most amount of water, and the most amount of crude oil. However, it consumes 0 raw quartz. So this is the part of the video where you have to ask yourself the question, do you care more about bauxite or raw quartz? If you're just in it for saving bauxite, you might want to use the first or second recipe. However, if you don't want to get raw quartz involved, you might prefer this last recipe, which is also quite a simple recipe. Not to mention, this actually consumes the least amount of power, but only just, like you save like 1 point something megawatts compared to the basic recipe. But again, this is really a personal thing. What do you want to go with? Because personally, I really like this last recipe, because I just don't want to be getting my raw quartz involved, because I've got bigger plans for this later on, aka I'm using it for my diamond recipes. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you. I know it's a bit of a long one today, but there's a lot of information to get through, so well done for sticking through with it. Now, since we've done our Alumina Solution, Aluminium Scrap, Aluminium Ingots, it's time to talk about not Aluminium Casing. The reason as to why I say that is because we've actually missed one category, and that is our Alclad aluminium sheets. But why have I missed it out from the list? Well, simply put, there's no alternate recipe. There's just one recipe for this thing, which is aluminium ingots, which we've talked about, and copper ingots. And I assume if you're watching this video, you know how to make copper ingots, but if not, it requires copper ore and a smelter. That's it. In fact, I'll actually be talking a bit more about copper ingots a bit later on. But yep, that's the reason as to why I haven't really mentioned this much in today's video, because there's only one recipe for it. It's either do this or don't bother doing it at all, but this is actually a very important thing to make, because it makes things, for example, like the Mark V conveyor belt. This thing, up until 1.0, was the best conveyor belt in the game. Of course, you also get the conveyor lift as well. So, Alclad aluminium sheets is actually relatively important. But I hope that makes sense as to why I didn't include it on the spreadsheet. Okay, now that we got that out the way, let's talk about our aluminium casing. And to make 60 casing per minute, which is what I'll be doing for both of these examples, because there's only 2 examples, we have to consume 90 aluminium ingots, which then consumes 180 aluminium scrap. And because we've already talked about this in extensive detail, I won't spend too much time mumbling about it, since I know yapping is the last thing you want to hear at this stage of the video. But in total, this will consume 90 bauxite, 90 water, and only 9 crude oil per minute. And obviously, like I keep saying, you actually have to consume less water from a water extractor if you cycle in the 63 water from here. You only then have to consume 27 water per minute, which is fantastic. Power consumption wise, this is not too bad. Unfortunately, we do have to use 4 refineries for this, including 1 water extractor, 3 smelters, and 1 constructor, which consumes 72 megawatts worth of power. If it was 27, that would have been very surprising, but no, 72 megawatts worth of power. Is it the best? Well, let's talk a bit more about our second recipe, which seems way more complex, but that's only because we've got copper ingots involved. And this is our Alclad casing recipe, where again, we are making 60 aluminium casings per minute, where we have to consume 40 copper ore to make our 40 copper ingots. Not bad at all. And we then only have to consume 80 aluminium ingots compared to the 90 aluminium ingots from before, so you're saving 10 aluminium or aluminum ingots per minute. Obviously that then means you consume less bauxite, less water and less crude oil than the first recipe, which has a pretty big effect down here. So yeah, you have to consume a bit more copper. You save on 3 relatively important parts, not including water, because that's again almost infinite. In regards to power, we are consuming 4 refineries, 1 water extractor, 5 smelters, and 1 constructor, which brings our total to 80.6 megawatts worth of power, which is more than our first example. Let's compare both these recipes side by side. Our first recipe consumes the most amount of bauxite, it consumes the most amount of water, and it consumes the most amount of crude oil. However, you end up saving a little bit of power, which is not too bad. Our second recipe consumes the least amount of bauxite, the least amount of water, the least amount of crude oil. However, you do have to consume 40 copper per minute, and it does require a bit more power, and you get a bit less polymer resin, but again, this is such a small number, it's not even worth talking about. So, what recipe would I recommend? Well, to be honest, I would actually recommend the Alclad casing recipe, because yeah, you do have to consume a bit more copper, which is a bit of a shame, but there is so much copper in your world, and if you're able to save on bauxite, water, and crude oil, it then means that you can just end up making more aluminium ingots, which then means you can make more aluminium casing if you consume a bit more copper. So I think this recipe is actually fantastic. And of course, if we have a very quick look at this, everything here is what I would consider the perfect aluminium recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. If they end up changing some recipes in 1.1, I will probably cry myself to sleep because I've spent like way too long working all of this for them to just to change it, but you never know. But if it was up to me in update 1.0, these are all the aluminium recipes I would recommend going with. And the reason why I've spread the video out like this rather than just getting straight onto this is because I wanted to try and give my points for every single recipe to try and either recommend alternate recipes than what I'm using if you so wish, or to try and convince you that some recipes just aren't as good as you think. But again, some of this is just personal opinion. If you want to use the silica recipe for the aluminium solution to begin with, then go ahead. If you don't, then that's okay. Regardless, thank you so much for watching and sticking through this video. Apologies for it being so long, but there was so much important information I wanted to talk about that I wanted to make this video a bit longer than usual. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. Before we go, a massive shout out to the Knights of the Realm channel members. We have Asuna Yuki, Variance, Natormal, Yamikel Burns, Hios Rising, Scotland Hattie, and Mau Mau. If you decide to become a Knight of the Realm for just £2.99 a month, you get access to channel-only emotes, unique badges, and also shoutouts in videos. Memberships are the best way to support my channel, but you don't have to become a member. Even just by watching today's video, you are supporting the channel massively. Here's a couple more videos I've made that you might be interested in. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Have an amazing rest of your day, and remember, Godspeed.